I was never good at pretending. My wife, Patricia, used to say that was my one great flaw, that my face told the truth before my mouth ever could. So when I sat across from my son-in-law at the dinner table and smiled warmly at his jokes, you'd think he would have noticed something was off. He didn't. That was his first mistake. And as it turned out, it was also his last. My name is Franklin. I'm 67 years old, and I spent 31 years as a high school principal in Hamilton, Ontario. I've dealt with liars my entire career, teenagers who swore they hadn't cheated, parents who insisted their child could do no wrong, staff members who smiled to my face and complained behind my back. After 3 decades of that, I'd like to think I developed a certain sensitivity to the smell of dishonesty. It has a particular quality to it, like something left too long on the stove. You don't always see the smoke right away, but you smell it. I retired 4 years ago, 2 months after Patricia passed. Pancreatic cancer. She was gone in 11 weeks from diagnosis, which the doctors said was fast even by the cruel standards of that particular disease. I didn't fight the retirement after she left. The school felt hollow without knowing she'd be home when I got there. So I took my pension. I kept the house on Herkimer Street that we'd owned for 22 years, and I tried to figure out what a man does with himself when the 2 things that defined him, his work and his wife, are suddenly gone. What kept me going was my daughter, Naomi. She was 32 at the time, working as a physiotherapist at a clinic near Dundas Street, living in a condo in the West End. We had dinner every Sunday. We talked every other day. She was, if I'm being honest, the reason I didn't simply fold in on myself during those first gray months after her mother died. Naomi has Patricia's eyes and my stubbornness, which is either a blessing or a curse, depending on who you ask. She met Derek about 8 months after the funeral. He was 38, divorced once, worked in commercial real estate. He was the kind of man who arrived at your door with a firm handshake and an easy smile and said all the right things in the right order. Naomi brought him to Sunday dinner in the spring, and I watched him the way I used to watch students who came into my office. Not unkindly, but carefully. He complimented the house. He asked about Patricia in a way that felt rehearsed rather than genuine, a half-beat too smooth. He said he'd heard so much about me from Naomi and that he had enormous respect for educators. I thanked him and passed the roasted potatoes and said nothing else that evening. "What do you think?" Naomi asked me after he'd gone home. "I think he's got a good handshake," I said. She laughed and told me I was impossible. I didn't say what I actually thought, which was that the man had spent the entire evening asking questions about the house, about the neighborhood, about how long I'd owned it, about whether I'd thought about downsizing. He framed it all as casual conversation, as polite interest in an older man's life. But there was a pattern to the questions that I recognized. I'd seen it before, in parents who came to my office not to understand their child's situation, but to scout it to figure out what they were dealing with before deciding how to proceed. Derek was assessing something. I just didn't know what yet. They dated for 11 months. He moved into her condo. I kept my Sunday dinners and my careful observations and my silence. I am not a man who makes accusations without evidence. Patricia always said that too, that I was methodical to the point of exasperation. But methodical means you're rarely wrong. The engagement came on a Tuesday in March, which I thought was an odd choice for a proposal, though I kept that thought to myself. Naomi called me, voice bright and full, and I told her I was happy for her, and I meant part of that completely. The part I was happy about was her happiness. The other part of me, the part that had been watching Derek for nearly a year, felt something tighten in my chest that I couldn't entirely explain. He asked me formally for my blessing 2 weeks later, over coffee at a cafe on King Street. I gave it to him. I shook his hand and I looked him in the eye and I said I wished them both every happiness. And while I meant that too, truly, for Naomi I had already, by that point, started making some quiet arrangements of my own. Let me explain why. 3 months into the engagement, Derek began making suggestions. Small ones at first, the way water starts with a trickle before it finds the crack. He mentioned, very casually over dinner, that the real estate market in Hamilton had softened and that my house, my paid-off, 22-year-old house on Herkimer Street was probably sitting at a value I wasn't making any use of. He said he knew people in the industry, developers who were looking in that neighborhood, that I could probably get a very strong number if I were open to it. I told him I wasn't interested in selling. He nodded and moved on and didn't bring it up again for 6 weeks. Then it came back, reframed. He mentioned that the upkeep on a house like mine must be significant for one person, that there were beautiful retirement communities north of the city, very comfortable, very well run, that some of his clients had made that transition and found it gave them tremendous peace of mind. He said all of this while cutting his chicken into careful pieces, not quite looking at me. I find my house gives me considerable peace of mind as it is, I told him. He laughed. Of course. But the questions about my finances didn't stop. They evolved. He asked, seemingly out of curiosity, whether I was happy with my financial advisor. He mentioned a colleague of his who managed portfolios for retirees. Very favorable returns. Maybe worth a conversation. He asked once, just once, and lightly whether I had a will in place, whether Naomi was aware of my financial situation, whether I'd thought about estate planning now that I was getting older. He said getting older the way you'd say it to someone who was already halfway out the door, and I was 66 at the time, in good health, walking 4 kilometers every morning along the waterfront trail. I didn't say any of this to Naomi. Not yet. Because I had no proof of anything except a feeling, and feelings are not evidence. But I did call my lawyer. Her name is Margaret, and she's been my lawyer for 18 years. She did the conveyance when Patricia and I bought the house. She handled Patricia's estate. And she is, without exaggeration, one of the sharpest people I have ever known. I explained the situation to her over the phone, keeping my voice neutral and factual the way I used to brief school board members. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I appreciate about Margaret. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. You want to be protected, she said. I want to be certain, I said. There's a difference. We met in her office on Main Street East the following week. She had already prepared several things for me to consider. We updated my will, which had not been touched since before Patricia died. We established a clear record of my assets, the house, my RRSP, my TFSA, my teacher's pension, and we ensured all of it was documented in current, witnessed, legal form with no ambiguity about ownership or intent. She also made a recommendation I hadn't anticipated. She suggested I have a capacity assessment done by my doctor, proactively, to create a formal record confirming I was in full mental and legal competency. It would make any future challenge to my decisions significantly harder to mount. You think someone might try to claim I'm incompetent? I asked. I think, she said carefully, that people who are interested in an elderly person's estate sometimes prepare that argument in advance. Better to close that door before anyone thinks to open it. I made the appointment with my doctor the next day. The wedding was in September, at a vineyard near Niagara-on-the-Lake. It was a beautiful day. Naomi looked exactly like her mother in the photographs from our own wedding, which hit me somewhere below the ribs in a way I hadn't prepared for. I danced with her before the dinner, and I held her hand and I told her that her mother would have been so proud, and I meant every single syllable of that. Whatever I thought about Derek, my daughter's joy that day was real, and I honored it completely. They moved into a larger house in Ancaster, 6 months after the wedding, which Derek purchased. I helped them move. I came for dinners. I watched. It was in February, about 14 months after the wedding, that things began to accelerate. Derek started stopping by my house more frequently. Not with Naomi, who had a demanding clinical schedule. Alone, or sometimes with the excuse of picking something up, dropping something off. He was always pleasant. He always asked how I was feeling, whether I'd seen my doctor lately, whether the cold was getting to me. He said it with warmth, with apparent concern, and if I hadn't been watching carefully, I might have received it that way. One afternoon he arrived unannounced while I was reading in the living room. He said he was in the neighborhood and wanted to check in. We had tea. He asked me for what I calculated was the fourth time in varying forms over 2 years whether I had thought any more about downsizing, about simplifying things for myself. He mentioned that he'd spoken to someone at a very reputable financial firm, that he could arrange an introduction if I was ever interested in restructuring my savings. I told him I was quite happy with my current arrangements. You know, he said, setting down his mug, Naomi worries about you. Living alone out here. She doesn't always say it, but she does. Then I'll talk to Naomi, I said pleasantly. He left 30 minutes later. After his car turned off the street, I sat in my kitchen for a long time. I called Margaret that evening. The document she'd been preparing at my request for the previous 4 months was nearly complete. It was a comprehensive, notarized record of my full estate, my intentions, and my legal and mental competency dated, witnessed, and filed with her office. My will had been updated a second time since the first revision, and I had added a clause that I will not detail here but that Margaret described as elegant, and that would make any interference with my estate a matter of immediate legal consequence for the interfering party. I had also, in January, quietly changed the locks on my house and installed a security system, not because I was afraid of a break-in in the traditional sense, but because I am a methodical man, and methodical men close the doors they can close before the wind picks up. The following month, Derek called me on a Wednesday morning. He said Naomi had asked him to call. She was worried I had seemed forgetful lately, that she'd noticed a few things, that they both wanted to make sure I was managing all right. He said it in a caring voice, a concerned son-in-law voice. He mentioned that if I ever felt overwhelmed, they'd be happy to help me manage things, that they could be added to accounts, to documents, just to make things easier for me. He said easier for me the way you'd say it about someone who could no longer manage the stairs. I was quiet for a moment. Derek, I said, I appreciate your concern. I'm going to speak with Naomi directly about this. You and I can continue this conversation another time. There was a brief pause. Of course, he said. Of course, Franklin. I called Naomi that evening. I asked her directly whether she had asked Derek to make that call, whether she was worried about my memory, whether she had concerns she hadn't brought to me herself. She was confused. She had not asked him to call. She had not expressed those concerns to him. She said she'd been talking to him about how I seemed quieter lately, more withdrawn, but that she hadn't said. Her voice changed while we were talking. I could hear the shape of the realization moving through her, and I felt terribly sad for her in that moment, because I knew it was only the beginning. Dad, she said quietly, what's going on? I need you to come for dinner on Saturday, I said, and I need you to come alone. She came on Saturday. I made the roast chicken with the herb crust that was her mother's recipe, and I put on the record player because Naomi has always thought more clearly with music in the room, same as her mother. And then I sat across from my daughter and I told her everything. Not accusation by accusation, but in the sequence I'd watched it, unfold the questions about the house, the suggestions about downsizing, the financial advisor, the estate planning comment, the call about my competency, the pattern that had been building for 2 years beneath the surface of pleasantries and firm handshakes. I also told her what I had already done. I told her about Margaret, about the documents, about the capacity assessment, about the locks. I told her that I had not been sitting passively at my kitchen table getting older. I had been paying attention, and I had been prepared. Naomi didn't speak for a long time after I finished. She sat with her hands around her coffee mug, staring at the table, and I didn't rush her because there is no timeline for that kind of quiet. I thought he was looking out for you, she said finally, and her voice was very small. I thought he genuinely liked you. He may genuinely like me, I said. That and the rest of it can both be true, but why would he? She stopped. Started again. We don't need your money, Dad. Derek does well. I looked at her gently. Naomi. Does he? Do you know that independently? The silence that followed that question was a different kind of silence from the one before it. She started looking into things that night, with her own accounts, her own eyes, not through Derek. What she found over the following 2 weeks I will not detail here because it is her story more than mine, and she has asked me to respect that. I will say only that the picture was more complicated than either of us had fully understood, and that Derek's interest in my assets had not been as casual or as innocent as his pleasant voice had suggested. He did not see what was coming. When Naomi confronted him, she did it with Margaret present and with documents that made very clear the legal ground she and I both stood on. The conversation was not long. Derek is a man who calibrates quickly, who understands when a position is untenable, and he understood it then. He did not try the competency argument, because there was a formal assessment on file dated 14 months prior saying I was in full capacity, and he knew Margaret would have it ready before he finished the sentence. I was not there for that conversation. Naomi had asked me not to be, and I respected that. She is her mother's daughter. She wanted to handle it standing on her own feet, not sheltered behind mine. I was proud of her beyond my ability to express it. The separation was filed in the spring. It was not contested in the way it might have been if Derek had believed he had anything to gain from a long fight. He didn't. Margaret had made certain of that. There is something I want to say, because I have thought about it a great deal in the months since. I am not a man who celebrates another person's downfall. I did not feel triumphant when Derek walked out of that conversation. What I felt was tired and sad for my daughter, and something else that took me a while to name. It was grief. I think grief, for the version of events I had hoped would prove me wrong. There is a part of a father that always hopes his instincts about a person are mistaken, because the alternative means his child has been hurt. But I also felt something that I can only describe as the specific satisfaction of a man who did not wait, who did not tell himself it would probably be fine, who did not give fear and denial enough room to get comfortable. Patricia used to tell me that my greatest strength and my most aggravating quality were the same thing. I paid attention when other people had already moved on to other thoughts. She was right. She usually was. Naomi moved back to the West End, a different condo from her old one. New beginning rather than going backwards. She comes for Sunday dinner. We are working our way through every record in the collection her mother left, one Sunday at a time. Last week we got to Aretha Franklin's Amazing Grace, which Patricia had played on repeat for the entire winter of 2003, and we sat there in the living room on Herkimer Street and didn't say very much at all. And it was exactly what both of us needed. My house is still mine. My RRSP, my TFSA, my pension, the 22 years of equity in these walls, all of it is exactly where it was and where it will remain until I decide otherwise, in full clarity, of my own will. The locks work well. The security system is set every night. Margaret checks in quarterly. I am 67 years old and I live alone, and I walk 4 kilometers along the waterfront trail every morning in every kind of weather. And I am telling you this not because I want your sympathy or your admiration, but because I know I am not the only one. I know there are other parents sitting across dinner tables from people who ask just a few too many questions in just the right order. I know there are other older men and women who feel that thing, that animal alertness, the hair on the back of the neck, the knowledge that something is not right, even before you can articulate what it is. And I know that too many of us dismiss it, tell ourselves we're being uncharitable, tell ourselves they mean well, tell ourselves we're getting older and perhaps we don't understand how the world works anymore. Let me tell you something I learned in 31 years in education. The children who were most at risk were never the ones who came to me in obvious distress. They were the ones who had learned to manage the appearance of everything being fine. The danger was always in what was being carefully concealed beneath a pleasant surface. People don't change that much after they leave school. They just get better at the concealment. Trust your instincts. Then do something about them. Not in anger, not with accusations, methodically, quietly, with documentation and good legal counsel, and the kind of patience that outlasts even the most determined opponent. I was never good at pretending, but I turned out to be very good at waiting. And in the end, waiting was enough. If you are watching from somewhere in this country, from Halifax to Victoria, from Windsor to Whitehorse, and something in this story felt familiar, I want you to know that familiar feeling is information. Don't ignore it. Don't tell yourself you're imagining things. And don't wait until someone has already taken something from you to start protecting what's yours. Naomi is well. She is strong and she is healing. And she told me last Sunday, while we were washing up after dinner, that she was grateful I had never once said I told you so. I told her that wasn't gratitude she owed me. That was just basic decency between people who love each other. She hugged me for a long time after that, the way she used to when she was small, and I stood in the kitchen of the house her mother and I built our life in, and I held on to her, and I thought that this right here was what all of it had been for. The house is still standing. My daughter is still standing. And I am still walking the waterfront trail every morning at 7:30 in every kind of Canadian weather, for as long as my legs will carry me. That is enough. That is more than enough.